The diary was found in a coffee can buried beneath the floorboards of a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, in the autumn of 1974. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, its roof collapsed, its walls leaning inward like the ribs of a dying animal. A team of archaeologists from the University of Kentucky had been surveying the area, documenting the remains of the coal camps that had once dotted the hillsides. They were not looking for secrets. They were looking for artifacts, pieces of the everyday lives of the miners who had worked the seams of the Paint Creek Valley. They found the coffee can by accident, its rusted lid still sealed with a strip of leather that had petrified to the hardness of bone. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a woman's handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The first entry was dated April 3, 1892. The last was dated June 17, 1894. The woman who had written it identified herself only as the widow of Paint Creek, and she had written not to preserve her memory but to record a confession. The journal was a chronicle of terror, a detailed account of a conspiracy that had claimed the lives of more than 30 men, a conspiracy that had been buried along with the bodies in the deep shafts of the Paint Creek mines. She wrote of a secret society, a group of mine owners and lawmen who had conspired to eliminate the union leaders who threatened their profits. She wrote of midnight executions, of bodies dropped into mine shafts, of families who were told their husbands and fathers had died in accidents. She wrote of her own complicity, her own role in the violence, and she wrote of her fear that she would be the next to die. The journal ended with a final, chilling entry, *, they know I have written this. They know I have kept the names. They are coming for me. If this book is ever found, let it be known that the truth is buried in the shaft at the end of Coal Hollow. Let it be known that the dead are not dead. They are waiting. *. The archaeologists who found the diary read its contents with growing horror. They recognized the names of the men and families mentioned in its pages, names that still echoed in the hollows and hollers of Paint Creek. They knew the story of the mine wars, the bloody conflict that had consumed the region in the 1890s and early 1900s. They had studied the history, but they had never imagined that the truth was so dark, so personal, so immediate. The journal was brought to the attention of a historian named Clara Davidson, a specialist in the labor history of the Appalachian coal fields. Davidson had spent 20 years studying the mine wars, the violent clashes between union organizers and mine owners that had shaped the region's history. She had written books and articles, had testified before Congress, had become one of the leading voices on the subject. But even she was unprepared for what she found in the widow's journal. The journal was not just a historical document. It was a crime scene, a confession, a key to a mystery that had been unsolved for more than 80 years. The Paint Creek Valley, in the southwestern corner of West Virginia, was a place of breathtaking beauty and grinding poverty. The mountains rose steeply on either side of the creek, their slopes covered in hardwood forests, their hollows filled with the dark, cool air of the Appalachian spring. The valley had been settled in the early 19th century by farmers and small-scale miners, men who had scratched a living from the thin soil and the coal that lay beneath it. But in the 1880s, the coal companies arrived, and everything changed. The companies bought up the land, the mineral rights, and the towns. They built mines, railroads, and company stores. They brought in workers from around the world, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, African Americans from the South, men who were desperate for work and willing to accept any conditions. They housed the workers in company-owned towns, paid them in company scrip, and controlled every aspect of their lives. The miners were not free men. They were serfs, bound to the company by debt and desperation. The conditions in the mines were appalling. The work was dangerous, and the death toll was high. Cave-ins, explosions, and accidents were common, and the companies did little to protect their workers. The miners were paid by the ton, and they were expected to produce regardless of the risks. The men who survived the mines often died young, their lungs filled with coal dust, their bodies broken by years of labor. The company's grip on the valley was absolute, but it was not unopposed. In the early 1890s, the United Mine Workers of America began organizing in Paint Creek, and the miners responded with enthusiasm. They formed unions, held meetings, and demanded better wages and safer conditions. The companies, led by a consortium of coal barons known as the Kana Coal Operators Association, responded with violence. They hired private armies, armed guards, and Pinkerton detectives to break the unions. They evicted union members from their homes, blacklisted them from the mines, and beat and killed those who resisted. The mine wars that followed were among the most violent labor conflicts in American history. The miners fought back with rifles and dynamite, and the company men responded in kind. The battle lines were drawn, and the valley became a war zone. Men died on both sides, and the casualties mounted. The governor of West Virginia sent in the state militia to restore order, but the militia was often sympathetic to the companies and joined in the repression. The journal found in the cabin was a window into this world, a personal account of the violence that had consumed the valley. The widow, whose name was not given in the journal, had been married to a union leader, a man who had been murdered by the company's hired guns. She had been left alone, her children taken from her, her home destroyed. She had survived by keeping her head down, by pretending to accept the company's rule, by doing what she was told. But she had never forgotten the truth. She had written it all down, the names of the killers, the names of the victims, the details of the conspiracy. Clara Davidson's investigation began with the journal itself. She transcribed its contents carefully, preserving every word, every sentence, every fragment. The journal was a remarkable document, a detailed account of the conspiracy that had claimed the lives of the union leaders. The widow had written of meetings held in secret, of plans made in the dark, of orders given by men whose names were never spoken aloud. She had written of the mine owners' determination to crush the union, of their willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. She had also written of her own involvement. She had been a spy, an informant for the union. She had attended the meetings of the company men, had listened to their plans, and had reported back to the union leaders. She had been betrayed by someone close to her, and she had been forced to flee. She had hidden in the cabin, waiting for the inevitable end, writing her diary as a legacy, a testament to the truth. Davidson's research led her to the archives of the Kana Coal Operators Association, which had been donated to a university in Ohio in the 1950s. The archives were vast, containing thousands of documents, including letters, reports, and photographs. She spent months combing through them, looking for any trace of the conspiracy described in the journal. She found evidence of the violence, of the company's brutal treatment of the miners, but she could not find the names of the killers. She also searched the court records of Kana County, looking for any mention of the murders that had been recorded in the journal. She found nothing. The murders had never been investigated. The bodies had never been found. The families had never received justice. The conspiracy had been a success, a crime that had been erased from the official record. But Davidson was not deterred. She knew that the truth was out there, and she was determined to find it. She returned to the Paint Creek Valley, to the hollows and hollers where the murders had taken place. She talked to the descendants of the miners, the elderly men and women who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told. She listened to their tales, their legends, their fears. And slowly, she pieced together the puzzle. The first major break in the investigation came from an unexpected source. In the summer of 1976, Davidson received a letter from a man named Thomas Ransom, who claimed to be the grandson of the woman who had written the journal. Ransom had read about Davidson's research in a newspaper article and wanted to help. He had grown up in the valley, he wrote, and he remembered the stories his grandmother had told him. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew the truth. Davidson was skeptical at first. She had received many letters from people claiming to know the truth, and most of them had been false. But there was something about Ransom's letter that struck her as authentic. The details he included, the names he mentioned, the descriptions of the murders, all matched the journal. She decided to meet him. Ransom was an elderly man, in his 70s, with the stooped shoulders and gnarled hands of a lifelong miner. He lived in a small house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by the mountains that had defined his life. He welcomed Davidson with a cup of coffee and a long, slow story. He told her that his grandmother, whose name was Margaret Odell, had been a widow, her husband killed by the company's hired guns. She had been a spy for the Union, a courageous woman who had risked her life to bring the company's crimes to light. She had written the journal as a record of the conspiracy, a document that could be used to bring the killers to justice. But she had been discovered, and she had been forced to flee. Ransom also told Davidson that his grandmother had not died in the cabin. She had survived, had escaped into the mountains, had lived for many years under an assumed name. She had died in 1924, her secrets buried with her. But before she died, she had given Ransom a map that showed the location of the bodies of the Union men who had been murdered by the company. The map had been hidden in the same cabin where the diary had been found, but it had been overlooked by the archaeologists. Ransom had retrieved it years ago and had kept it safe ever since. Ransom pulled a faded piece of paper from his pocket and spread it on the table. The map was crude, drawn in pencil on a scrap of brown paper, but it was detailed. It showed the Paint Creek Valley, with the mines marked, the roads, and the hollows. At the end of a hollow labeled Coal Hollow, there was an X. The X, Ransom explained, marked the location of a mine shaft that had been sealed in 1894. The shaft was filled with the bodies of the Union leaders who had been murdered by the company. The bodies had never been recovered. Davidson stared at the map, her mind racing. If the bodies were still there, if the shaft had never been opened, there might still be evidence, proof of the conspiracy. She asked Ransom if he had ever tried to open the shaft. He shook his head. He was too old, he said, too weak. He had been waiting for someone to come, someone who would believe him. He had been waiting for her. The discovery of the map was a turning point in Davidson's investigation. She had found the evidence she needed, the physical proof of the conspiracy. But she also knew that the shaft was on private property, land that was still owned by the descendants of the coal barons who had committed the murders. She would need permission to excavate, and she knew that the owners would not grant it. She turned to the West Virginia Department of Mines and Minerals, asking them to investigate the shaft. The department was reluctant at first, citing the dangers of exploring abandoned mines. But Davidson persisted, and eventually, they agreed to conduct a survey. They sent a team of engineers to the location marked on the map, and they found the shaft, just as Ransom had said. It had been sealed with a concrete cap, a cap that had been poured in 1894. Beneath the cap, the engineers found a void, a dark space that had not been disturbed for more than 80 years. The department agreed to open the shaft. The excavation was a difficult and dangerous operation, but it was successful. The engineers found the bodies of the Union leaders, their remains remarkably well preserved by the dry, cool conditions of the mine. The bodies had been stripped of their clothing and identification, but the engineers found personal effects that allowed the victims to be identified. They also found bullet holes in the skulls of several of the bodies, evidence that they had been executed. The discovery of the bodies was a sensation. The news spread quickly, and the descendants of the victims came forward, demanding justice. The families filed lawsuits against the descendants of the coal barons, and the courts were forced to confront the truth of the Paint Creek conspiracy. The investigation that followed was one of the largest and most complex in West Virginia's history. The investigation revealed a conspiracy that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The mine owners had not just killed the Union leaders, they had killed anyone who threatened their profits. They had hired assassins, men who traveled from mine to mine, eliminating anyone who spoke out against the companies. They had used local officials, who were often on the company payroll, to cover up the murders. They had created a system of terror that had kept the miners in line for decades. The names of the killers were revealed, men who had been protected by their wealth and their power. They were not just local businessmen, they were prominent figures in the state, men who had served in the legislature, who had been appointed to judgeships, who had been respected members of their communities. The conspiracy was not a secret, it was an open secret, a truth that everyone knew but no one dared to speak. The investigation also revealed that the massacre at Paint Creek was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of violence that had extended across the Appalachian coal fields, a systematic campaign of murder that had been carried out by the coal companies for more than 30 years. The bodies that had been found in the shaft at Coal Hollow were just the tip of the iceberg. There were other shafts, other hollows, other caches of bones that were never found. The final twist in the investigation came when Davidson discovered that the widow, Margaret Odell, had not been the only spy. She had been part of a network, a group of women who had worked together to document the company's crimes. The women had kept diaries, letters, and photographs, records that had been hidden for generations. Davidson found them in attics, in basements, in the walls of cabins, a treasure trove of evidence that finally allowed the full story of the Paint Creek conspiracy to be told. The story of Margaret Odell is a story of courage and sacrifice, a tale of a woman who risked everything to bring the truth to light. She had been a widow, her husband murdered by the company's hired guns. She had been a mother, her children taken from her. She had been a spy, an informant who had documented the crimes of the coal barons. She had been a survivor, a woman who had lived through horrors that would have broken most people. But she was also a woman of conscience, a woman who believed that the truth was worth dying for. She had written the diary as a legacy, a testament to the courage of the men who had died in the Paint Creek mines. She had hidden it in the cabin, knowing that it would one day be found. She had trusted in the future, in the belief that the truth would eventually prevail. The discovery of Margaret Odell's diary was a gift to history, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for generations. It allowed the descendants of the miners to understand the fate of their ancestors, to know the truth of their deaths. It allowed the families to find closure, to finally lay their loved ones to rest. And it allowed the nation to confront the violence and injustice that had marked the coal fields of Appalachia. But the story of Paint Creek is not just a story of the past. It is a story of the present, of the ongoing struggle for justice that continues to shape the region. The coal mines that once dominated the valley have largely closed, but the legacy of violence and exploitation persists. The descendants of the miners still live in the hollows, still struggle with poverty and hardship. The echoes of the mine wars still linger, a reminder of the price of injustice. The bodies that were found in the shaft at Coal Hollow were finally given a proper burial. They were interred in a cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley, a place of peace and rest. The descendants of the victims attended the ceremony, their faces etched with sorrow and pride. The governor of West Virginia spoke, offering a belated apology for the state's role in the repression. The families wept, and they hoped that the final truth had finally been revealed. But the story did not end there. In 1980, Clara Davidson published a book about her investigation, detailing the conspiracy that had been uncovered. The book was a critical success, and it won several awards. But it also stirred controversy, with some critics accusing her of sensationalizing the story. The debate over the Paint Creek conspiracy continues to this day, a testament to the enduring power of the story. Davidson also continued to research the mine wars, looking for other hidden graves, other forgotten victims. She found evidence of similar massacres in other parts of the Appalachian coal fields, and she believed that there were many more bodies waiting to be discovered. The story of Paint Creek, she argued, was not an isolated incident but a pattern of violence that had extended across the region. The diaries and letters of the women who had documented the company's crimes were collected and preserved in a museum, a monument to the courage and sacrifice of the women who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. They were a reminder of the power of the written word, of the ability of the past to speak to the present. In the end, the story of the Paint Creek conspiracy is a story of the power of truth, the courage of the oppressed, and the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story that challenges us to confront the darkest chapters of our past, to acknowledge the violence and injustice that have shaped our nation, and to work for a future that is more just and more humane. The diary of Margaret Odell, the widow of Paint Creek, is now housed in the archives of the West Virginia State Museum, a testament to the life and work of a courageous woman. It is a document of great historical significance, a reminder of the victims of the mine wars, and a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. The diary is read by scholars, students, and anyone who wants to understand the true history of Appalachia. But the diary also contains a mystery, one that Davidson was never able to solve. In the final entry, Margaret Odell wrote that she had hidden something else, something more important than the diary, something that would finally expose the conspiracy. She wrote that she had buried a box containing evidence of the company's crimes, and that she had marked its location with a symbol that only she could recognize. The symbol was not described in the diary, and its meaning was lost with her death. Davidson searched for the box for years, but she never found it. She believed that it was still out there, hidden in the mountains, waiting for someone to find it. The box, if it exists, could finally reveal the full extent of the conspiracy, the names of the men who had ordered the murders, the details of the cover-up. It could bring closure to the families of the victims and justice to the killers. It could be the final piece of the puzzle. The mystery of the box remains unsolved. The question of its location and its contents lingers, a haunting reminder of the secrets that the Appalachian Mountains still hold. The Diary of the Widow of Pain Creek is a testament to the truth, but it is also a testament to the limits of that truth, to the secrets that remain buried, to the stories that are still waiting to be told. In the autumn of 1985, Clara Davidson stood at the edge of Coal Hollow, looking out over the valley that had been the scene of so much suffering. The leaves were turning, the mountains ablaze with color. She thought of Margaret Odell, the widow who had risked everything to record the truth. She thought of the bodies that had been found in the shaft, the families who had finally found closure. She thought of the box that was still out there, waiting to be found. The wind rustled through the trees, and Davidson felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that the story was not over. She knew that the truth was still out there, hidden in the mountains, waiting for someone to find it. She turned away from the hollow and walked back to her car. The sun was setting, and the shadows were growing longer. She drove away from the valley, her mind filled with questions that would not be answered. She had uncovered a conspiracy, a massacre, a story of violence and courage. But she had not uncovered everything. The final secret, the box that the widow had hidden, was still out there, waiting for someone to find it. And as she drove, she wondered who would find it. And what would they find? The questions lingered, haunting her thoughts, a reminder of the past that is never truly past, the secrets that are never truly buried. The Diary of the Widow of Pain Creek is a testament to the courage of a single woman, a woman who refused to be silenced by the violence of the mine wars. It is a testament to the power of the written word, to the ability of the past to speak to the present. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring need to tell the truth, no matter the cost. The story of Pain Creek is a story that will never be fully told. There are too many secrets, too many forgotten graves, too many silenced voices. But the Diary of Margaret Odell, the widow of Pain Creek, is a piece of that story, a fragment of the truth that has been preserved for future generations. It is a challenge to us all, a reminder of the importance of remembering the past, of honoring the dead, of seeking justice for the oppressed. And it is a question that lingers, unanswered. What is in the box that the widow buried? And who will find it?